Dan Belak back here again talking to you about what psychologists do. Now these videos are short, so I'm going to be talking very quickly here. And again, the most important thing for you to do is read the book and follow up the book by looking at some of these lectures that I talked to you about. All right, when you think of a psychologist, what do you think? Stop for a moment and think about that. You probably think of somebody sitting by a couch and talking to people about problems. Well, if you did, you know, that's sort of true. Many psychologists are called clinical psychologists. Clinical psychologists help people with problems. And, you know, there's a large percentage of psychologists who go into clinical psychology. In order to become a clinical psychologist, you have to take undergraduate classes like you're taking right now, get a bachelor's degree in psychology, and then go to graduate school and get your PhD in psychology at an APA, that's the American Psychological Association, accredited school. Those schools will award you a PhD, you do a dissertation, and you can call yourself a clinical psychologist, open up a practice. Now, you're different from a psychiatrist, and as your book points out, psychiatrists go to medical school. Medical school is just like being a doctor. They get an MD, and then they do their residency in an institute of psychiatry, a psychological institute, and they have a different perspective than psychologists. While psychologists work on problems and depression and anxiety, psychiatrists do too, but psychiatrists have the added ability to prescribe medication. Psychologists cannot do that. Psychologists can work with psychiatrists and make suggestions, but the only ones who can write prescriptions are psychiatrists. But again, that's only a small part of what psychologists do. Many psychologists teach in academic setting and do research in specific disciplines. Now, if you go to Module 2, you'll see a list of several of the disciplines. I'm not going to talk about all of them right now, but the most interesting to me, obviously, since I'm a teacher, focuses on the learning, and there are many psychologists who study how individuals learn, not just humans, but also animals, how animals learn. So there's a large variety of psychologists who focus on what causes you to learn. How do you learn how to ride a bicycle, how to tie your shoes? At what age do you learn best? What's the best conditions for learning? So learning is a large area of psychology. Another one on that list you'll see is cognitive psychology. Cognitive, the word cognitive means thinking, or to think. Cognitive psychologists study what goes on inside your head. How are you thinking? What do you think? Do we all think the same, or do we all think differently? You're probably thinking, we all think differently. Well, that's the content of our thought. That's different, but the process of thinking, you'd be surprised, is very, very similar. Remember, we're all born without language, and then as we get older, we learn how to think in language, and then if we live in a different country, we think in a different language. So thinking evolves, and it moves in a lot of different directions. Cognitive psychologists study how thinking changes over time. And speaking of over time, another area of psychology that's quite fascinating is developmental psychology. Trident Technical Colleges offers a course called Human Growth and Development, in which we study the normal changes, psychological, physiological, cognitive, from conception through death. And you could probably think about those stages in your minds right now, you know. Childhood. How is childhood different from adolescence? How is adolescence different from adulthood? What are the issues that adults have that adolescents don't have? And vice versa. You know, what are the similarities between adolescents and adults and children? So developmental psychology breaks down the segments of the lifespan and follows them as I said, from conception all the way to death. Another very, very big area, and this is permeating all of psychology, is the area of neuroscience. Now, your book calls this physiological psychology. It also calls it neuroscience. This is a study of how the brain and the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous systems work. Specifically, how is the brain related to behavior? What parts of the brain affect what we do? You know, what parts of the brain are involved in love? What parts of the brain are involved in emotion, in anger? What parts of the brain are involved in intelligence? And how can we study those and learn about those? So the brain is a very, very important part of psychology, as is neuroscience. As you go through the book, you'll also see other areas like personality and social psychology. All of these are chapters that we're going to be studying. And social psychologists are very fascinating. Social psychologists study how regular people make psychological decisions like attitudes and opinions and why do you pick the person you love. That's social psychology. Social has to do with people. And one of our chapters, we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about how do we make social decisions, and why do we make them, and why do we make attributions about other people and what they do. So social psychology, another of the many, many areas and disciplines of psychology.